Iraq War, 20 years later. Collective Western amnesia about the Anglo-American crime of the century. Uncut News. The 30th of March, 2023.
The morally bankrupt Western media lied to start the Iraq War, as they also dutifully did in other wars for their imperial masters. 20 years later, the Western media is at it again. Last week, the 20th of March, marked the 20th anniversary of the start of the U.S.-British war against Iraq. The war claimed over 1 million human lives and led to 10 years of brutal military occupation. It spawned a sectarian civil war, millions of displaced and destitute people, and terrorism that swept the entire Middle East and large parts of Africa and Asia. Iraq and several other ancient nations were destroyed by the Anglo-American War. And it was a war based on blatant American and British lies about alleged Iraqi weapons of mass destruction. The 20th anniversary of the U.S.-British war against Iraq, which was also supported by NATO partners, should be an occasion for proper accountability and the prosecution of American and British politicians and military leaders for war crimes according to Nuremberg standards. Persons like George W. Bush, the former U.S. president, and Tony Blair, the former British Prime Minister, should go to jail for capital crimes. Current U.S. President Joe Biden should also be in the dock, as his role as a senior senator at the time was instrumental in making the war possible. Also to be indicted should be several Western media outlets, such as the New York Times and the Washington Post, which spread the lies used to justify the war. It is unfortunate that the man who shed so much light on the crimes, publisher Julian Assange, is languishing in a torture dungeon. 20 years later, there is an eerie sense of collective amnesia among Western politicians and media about the colossal war crimes associated with Iraq. It is almost as if they did not exist. The Western protagonists and their propaganda channels have got away with mass murder. This week marked the anniversary of another heinous day, shamefully committed with the same Western silence and indifference. On the 24th of March, 1999, the U.S.-led NATO military alliance unilaterally began bombing the former Yugoslavia for 78 consecutive days. Under the cynical pretext of humanitarian protection, thousands of civilians were killed in a military attack on that country that had not been approved by the United Nations at the time. The bombing, like the Iraq War only 4 years later, was carried out on the basis of unilateral action by Washington and its Western allies. A glance at the calendar unfortunately reveals countless such heinous anniversaries of unlawful American and Western military aggression. Among others, the 19th of March marks the NATO bombing of Libya in 2011. In a powerful essay by Ron Ridenour for the Strategic Culture Foundation, we are reminded of the extraordinary warmongering of the United States and its imperialist partners. Judging by the number of countries invaded and the resulting death toll, including the first use of nuclear bombs, the U.S. is certainly exceptional for all the wrong reasons. But what makes the record even more appalling is the impunity. The collective amnesia towards the Iraq War is perhaps the most damning symptom of impunity in recent decades. It also exposes the hypocrisy and moral bankruptcy of the so-called rules-based world order that Washington and its Western lackeys constantly rave about. The rules-based world order is an Orwellian whitewash for lawlessness and predation by rogue regimes that trample on the United Nations Charter and international law. The chronic impunity to which the United States has become accustomed in the murderous pursuit of its imperialist aims means that it never ceases its rogue state predations. They are repeat offenders because they have never been held accountable. There is an analogy here with the manner in which Washington relentlessly abuses the privileges conferred on the dollar as the world's reserve currency. Washington parasites all over the world by printing dollars and charging unreasonable rates for unearned services and goods. The machinations never seem to stop because there is no accountability. Similarly, the warmongering of the United States never stops. The bloodlust of its capitalist might and imperialist needs never stops. Crime is allowed to happen because the Western media is largely used to cover up the crimes with fabricated excuses and lies. The wars in Korea and Vietnam in the 1950s and 60s were whitewashed as crusades against communism instead of being reported as the genocidal imperialist rampages they were. Impunity for these enormous crimes then led to more wars and crimes. The Iraq War fits into this context. But there is also the historical factor of the Soviet Union and the supposed victory of the United States in the Cold War. Without a controlling counterpower, the U.S. rulers consumed themselves in the arrogance of their supposed unipolar dominance. It is no coincidence that after 1991 and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the United States waged even more debauched imperialist wars and espoused the tyrannical notion of a rules-based world order. The U.S. and its Western allies have brought about a permanent state of war on the planet in a short period of time. The U.S. led wars and covert interventions in Somalia, the Balkans, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Yemen, Syria, Georgia, and Ukraine, among others, all corresponded to the NATO alliance's self-imposed right to expand against Russia. The same U.S.-led military expansionism is underway against China. This is the correct context in which the current war in Ukraine should be understood and assessed. The same applies to the relentless military buildup against China in the Asia-Pacific region. The United States and its NATO allies are fueling the conflict in Ukraine by supplying endless amounts of weapons to that country. The latest step towards further escalation is the announcement by the UK to supply depleted uranium artillery shells to Ukraine. These toxic weapons were used by the US, UK, and NATO forces in the former Yugoslavia and Iraq, resulting in an unprecedented number of cancer deaths and birth defects among the civilian population. The crime of impunity is once again followed by another crime. The morally bankrupt Western media lied to start the Iraq War, just as they have dutifully started other wars for their imperial masters. 20 years after the 21st century crime they aided and abetted, the Western media is at it again. 20 years into the 21st century, the Western media are at it again, telling the world that Russia is an aggressor in Ukraine and that Russia and China are a threat to Western democracy. During a state visit to Moscow this week, China's President Xi Jinping and his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin declared the need for serious diplomacy to resolve the conflict in Ukraine. The Western powers and their lackeys in the media responded by rejecting such diplomacy and instead trying to vilify Russia and China as rogues against global security. It is quite easy to see who the real villains and liars are. The Iraq War is one of many such touchstones.